Sorry, hold on 1 second. Hannah for Refuah Shlema. And today we're going to continue talking about Dio. So here, the only thing that the Tur tells us about Dio is, he just says Dio. He just says that when you write tefillin, you have to write it with Dio. I will point out, and I think we'll do this in another shir, the Tur talks more about the Dio himself, not here, but in Hilchot Sefer Torah, which is in Yoredea Siman Resh Ayin Aleph. You can look there, and there's some interesting differences between the way the Shulchan Aruch speaks about Dio here and there, and there's quite a lot of discussion. I decided on balance to wait to look at that I want to try to better understand the sources that the Beit Yosef is bringing. So, yes, last time we looked at Dio from the Mishnah, we looked at the Sugya Masechet Eruvin. Now we're going to start looking at how the Beit Yosef himself starts talking about Dio. The other thing I just want to mention as a technical point, if I lose contact, if you can't hear me, please send me a message, and hopefully I'll stop until I reconnect. But I'm getting a message on my end that says my internet is unstable, so let's hope it doesn't affect the class. Okay, we go to Perek HaBoneh. I'm assuming everybody's familiar with this, but I didn't mention this earlier. I'll mention it now. Like earlier, he talks about Perek HaKometz. So, you know, Mishnayot are divided into chapters, right? There's Starim of Mishnah, which are divided into Masechtot. Masechtot are divided into Prakim, and then they're divided into individual Mishnayot. The first word or words usually of a perek is the name of that perek. So the first word in this perek is Haboneh, and that's why it's called Perek Haboneh. The one that we looked at previously from Masechet Menachot is Perek HaKometz. There are actually two prakim in Masechet Menachot that begin with the words HaKometz, the second and the third chapter. And so sometimes the third chapter is called HaKometz Rabbah, like the big HaKometz, or it's the larger one. It's the one that came, it's the second one. It's HaKometz Rabbah. Anyway, Perek HaBoneh, which we have the Mareh Makom for, but I think for the moment we'll just take it from the Beit Yosef. Tanya, Katav Shelo B'Dio, or Shekatav et Askarot B'Zahav, Hare Elu Yiganezu. So we learn in the Braita that if he wrote not with ink, or if he wrote the Azkarot, the Shemot Hashem, in gold, then these must be hidden away. In other words, they're not kosher, but they have certain level of kedusha. Certainly, Azkarot, Shemot Hashem, once you write them, no matter how you write them, you're not allowed to erase them. So the only thing you can do with them is to hide them away, right? So what do we see? So what do we see from this line in Masechet Shabbat about Dio? Anybody? Okay. You just simply see that if you wrote it, right? If you write Sefer Torah without, with something other than Dio, it's not kosher. So it tells you that you need to write with Dio. So this is where he begins his discussion, right? So in the Tur, it says you have to write tefillin with Dio. So he brings a proof from here. you have to write with Dio. The second part about writing Askarot B'Zahav, we'll talk about that later. It's an important line, but it's not immediately relevant to us. Yerushalmi Parakama de Megillah. In the Yerushalmi, the first chapter of Megillah, says Halacha Moshe Misinai Shu Kotvim Ba'orot Uvidyo. So he quotes just a snippet of the Sugya in Yerushalmi. It says that it's Halacha Moshe Misinai that we write on skins and with Dio. A little background about Halacha Moshe Misinai, just you may know this, but I'll just say it anyway. Halacha Moshe Misinai, broadly speaking, refers to halachot, which are considered to be dioraita. They're considered to have the status of a Torah law, but they are actually not in the written Torah. They're only part of the oral Torah. So we don't bring a verse, a proof text to prove these things. It's halacha Moshe Misinai. So it's another proof that you have to write with Dio. Down in the footnote, I brought a little bit more of that sugya. It says halacha Moshe Misinai shu kotvim ba'orot v'kotvim b'dio u'nesargalin b'kaneh. We rule with a reed. V'korchin b'seyar. We wrap with hair. V'tolin b'matlit, and we cover it with a matlit, with a piece of something or a scrap of something. V'dovkim b'devek, and we glue with glue. V'tofrim b'gidin, and we stitch with sinews. So these are all halachot that have to do with tefillin, and we will revisit these later on in the chapter. Okay, so far we have this braita here in Masechet Shabbat that says we write with Dio. We have halacha Moshe Misinai that we have to write with Dio. And now he says, Ketavo HaRambam b'Perek Rishon. The Rambam writes this in the first chapter of Hilchot Tefillin, halacha Gimel. V'Katvu HaTosfot b'Perek Sheni de Megillah. Tosfot also brings this. Tosfos writes in the second chapter of Megillah and in the second chapter of Gittin, B'Perek B'Mem Madlikin, which is the second chapter of Masechet Shabbat. What do they write? They write She'omer Rabbeinu Tam, Dio Shemetaknim Ba'afatzim Lo Mikre Dio. The dio that is prepared with afatzim, with gall, is not called dio. Okay, so in other words, beginning now where he starts the Katvu Atosfot, he's going to start to talk about this controversy about what you may or may not put into the dio. So Rabbeinu Tam held that dio that you make with afatzim, that you make with gall, is not called dio. And if it's not called dio, then of course you can't use it for writing stam. Now how does he know that? Miditnan b'Perek Sheni de Gittin, since we learn in the Mishnah in the second chapter of Gittin, b'Kol Kotvin b'Dio. Now we looked at this Mishnah last week. He's just bringing the words that are relevant to this particular argument. So it says that you write with everything. This is about a get. You can write a get with all these things, and it lists things. And the first thing that lists is with dio. You can write with dio. The Gemara says, Tani, Rabbi Chia learned, Ktavo b'mei tarya b'aftza kasher. If he wrote it with mei tarya and afatzim would be the gall, it's kosher, right? So now here, of course, he's speaking about a get. If you write a get with meitarya or with aftza, it's kosher. Mashmash Rabbi Chia ba lahosifa hamishnah. it sounds right. We learn from this. It's implied that Rabbi Chia is coming to add on to the Mishnah. So it follows that aftzah that Rabbi Chia is talking about is not the dio of our Mishnah. Okay, so these couple of lines here I thought might be a little confusing by themselves, and so that's why I sent you the sheet with this sugya in Masechet Gitin, which we'll take a look at now. Okay, so just to remind us, b'chol kotvim, right? We write the get with all things, right? Generally, we write with yo, with sam, sikra, komos, kankantum, v'chol davar shehu shel kayama. So the Gemara in the beginning wants to define the words. This, when you're learning Gemara, you should be aware of this, that there's a hierarchy of how the Gemara treats Mishnayot. The Gemara mainly is trying to understand Mishnayot. That's the main task that the Gemara is going to be doing. And so it might seem sometimes that the Gemara asks different questions on different Mishnayot, and it seems to be a bit of a mishmash. But in nearly every case, there's a pretty clear hierarchy of questions that the Gemara asks. So the first question the Gemara will always ask is, what do the words mean? Or what do the phrases mean? If the Gemara doesn't ask that question, it means it already knows, and it'll go on to the next question. But here the Gemara it's not clear. So the Gemara defines these terms. So dio, diuta. Diuta is the Aramaic term for dio. It's the Aramaic translation of dio. Sam, sama, right, is also the Aramaic for sam is sama, which Rashi explains is the orpimon, which is the arsenic-based yellowish pigment. Sikra, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Sikrita Shema. So he says, Sikra is what is actually called Sikrita, and Rashi explains Seva Adom, Shekarin Minio. It's a reddish color, it's a reddish pigment that was called Minio. I believe it's I had it in the other sheet. It's a lead, I believe it's a lead oxide.
Does it also have iron in it?
The Sikrita, no, not as far as I know. Not based on the sources that I saw. It's something that's derived from lead. Komos, kuma. So Rashi says kuma or koma is srafa ilan. It's now this term sraf, it's a little bit hazy to me. Apparently sraf is resin as opposed to sap. Sap and resin are not necessarily the same thing. I'm not much of a botanist, but I tried to research this a little bit better. The resin is something that you can derive from the tree, like the bark of the tree will have resin, and the sap is something that's coming up through the xylem or the foam, and it's like the sort of the circulatory system of the tree, and they're distinct. So we'll see this also in Tosfos. There's a little bit of discussion about that. Kankantum, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Shmuel. So what's kankantum? Charta d'ushchafi. It's the black of shoemakers. It's boot black. And Rashi explains Charta d'ushchafi is adramol. Okay, so Those are the basic definitions. So the Mishnah said, we write with all of these things, Uvechol davar shehu shel kayama, and anything which will stand, in other words, anything which will have some permanence. As we saw from last week, it doesn't mean it can't be erased, because dio, apparently by definition, is supposed to be something that you can erase with water, but it is nonetheless shel kayama. It's something that can stand. It lasts. So anytime the Mishnah gives a list and then gives what seems to be a general rule, so we want to know, what is it adding in that wasn't in the list? There has to be at least one more thing that wasn't in the list that's implied by this line of the Chol Davar Shehu Shel Kayama. So the Gemara, that's the next question. The Gemara, B'chol davar shehu mitkayem, latuye mai. What does that come to include? What does that bring in? Latuye had the Tani Rabbi Chanina. It comes to include that which Rabbi Chanina learned. And what did he learn? Ktavo b'mei tarya v'aftza kasher. If he wrote it with mei tarya or with aftza, aftza, it's here with an aleph, but it's the same as with an ayin, which is the afatzim, the gal. If you wrote it with meitarya or with afatzim, it's kasher. So what's meitarya? So Rashi says meitarya, he gives two explanations. He says meitarya is make shamim, it's rainwater. Lashon mori. That's what I learned from my master. That's what I learned from my teacher. But he gives his own explanation. Meitarya mayim sheshorim bo pri shuhu ke'en afatzim. It's water that had soaked in it some fruit that's like afatzim. He doesn't say what fruit it is. And afatzim, he just translates gals, right, which is the gall. That's just the translation of afatzim. It's not supposed to be a translation of Seir Meitarya. So so Meitarya, Rashi's explanation, his own explanation, would seem to make more sense, because writing with rainwater, it's just writing with water. And it doesn't seem like that would be something that you would consider to be any kind of permanent writing. It's not something that would be easily visible, depending on the surface you're writing on. It may not be visible at all. So Rashi says it's water that was soaked with some kind of fruit. I found later on in one of the references, which we'll touch on in a moment, from the Sefer Truma, that it was apparently some kind of a wild plum that would be soaked in water and used as a kind of ink. And that could be what Rashi was referencing. I've seen other people say that Rashi's talking about, I think Jastrow says that it's talking about wine sediment, wine lees. But it's some kind of fruit sediment or fruit that got mixed into water, and then it would be used for writing. And aftza is gall, right, is the gall nut. So one question we have when we're reading this is, when Rabbi Chanina says he wrote it with meitarya, the aftza, is the vav supposed to mean and, or is it supposed to mean or? That is, do we read this, he wrote it with meitarya, or if he wrote it with afatzim, it's kasher? Or does he mean if he wrote it with meitarya that was mixed with afatzim, that it's kasher? Is it one thing or is it two things? It could be that Rashi's teacher, who said it's make shamim, he understood it as one thing. In other words, it's rainwater that's mixed with afatzim. Rashi, because he brings his second perush, seems to think it's probably two things. That there's meitarya, which is mixed with it's water that was infused with some kind of fruit that's like afatzim, that would be one thing. And then aftza, or if you write with the afatzim themselves. Now, how do you write with afatzim themselves? Presumably you also soak them or you boil them. But there would be these two things. So so before we go back to the Beit Yosef, we'll just understand. The Mishnah says that we write with dio and all these other things, and anything that's shel kayama, anything that will last. So the Gemara says, what does anything that will last come to include? It comes to include, we'll take this second shot, that it's meitarya and aftza, that you can write a get either with meitarya or with aftza. And those are all kosher for writing a get. But what do you see? So now we know that whatever meitarya and whatever aftza is, right? Aftza is, we know a little bit better, it would be afatzim in some kind of solution. What we know is that they're not dio, right? Because they're only included in this line, but they're not included in dio. So now I know that if you write that afatzim is not dio. This is going to be the basic logic that Tosfos used, that Rabbeinu Tam used to make his argument. Afatzim is not dio. So let's take a little look at Tosfos, which is a little bit further down. Dio diuta. So Tosfos, the first Tosfos is on the very beginning of the Gemara, Dio diuta, and it says right away. There are different versions of this Tosfos that when the Beit Yosef said that the Tosfos wrote in Megillah and in Gittin and so forth, right? If you look in Tosfos on those dapim, you'll find a variation of this Tosfos here. But since we're here, we're going to look at it here. Omer Rabbeinu Tam Dio Shelanu Hu Karui Dio. Our Dio is called Dio. In other words, our Dio is the Dio that the Mishnah and the Gemara are talking about. Below oto shosin me'afatzim, and not that kind of dio that people make with gall. Tahahu lo mikre dio. That's not called dio. How does he know? Min detani Rabbi Chanina, since Gemara learns from Rabbi Chanina that tavo b'mei tarya b'aftza kasher. If you wrote it with either meitarya or with aftza, with afatzim, it's kasher. Mashma delav hainu dio, right? It implies that those things, meitarya and aftza, are not dio. Delotani elahanach delotani b'matnitim, because he's only going to learn things that were not already learned in the Mishnah, right? That was the whole point of Rabbi Chanina's statement, is to tell me something that I didn't know. It's to tell me what Uvachol Davar Shel Kanyama could include. It includes things that are not dio. So that's his first proof, that if you write with afatzim, it's not dio. So before I get to the next part, at this point, we need to ask ourselves a question about how to understand Rabbeinu Tam. So does Rabbeinu Tam mean that it sounds like Rabbeinu Tam is saying dio that has afatzim in it is not dio, even if what? Even if it was dio to begin with. He hasn't yet told us exactly what dio is, but even if you had dio shalanu, right, the dio that he says is our dio, that's the dio that the Gemara is talking about, even if you had that dio, but if you added me'afatzim to it, you've rendered it to be no longer dio. That seems to be what he's saying. Once you add afatzim to the dio, it's no longer dio. Uvesamuch, there's another proof. U'v'samuch de paricha Rabbi Aval damar b'mei milin me Rabbi Chanina amaylo parich midyo de matnitin. I debated about doing this part of the Gemara. It's a little bit further down on Daf Yud Tet, and I decided that it's a little bit too much of a side issue for us right now. But just suffice it to say that later on in the Gemara, in a separate discussion, the Gemara talks about mei milin. Mei milin is a term that was used for a gall solution, right? That was also used for writing. In other words, it's like the aftsa that's being spoken about in our part of the Gemara. They ask this question on Rabbi Aval about mei milin from Rabbi Chanina, and I'll just to give it a little bit of context. The Gemara there is talking about a question of you have to have witnesses sign a get. Let's say they don't know how to write. Let's say they are illiterate and they don't know how to write. How can you get them to sign? So there are different strategies that the Gemara suggests, and one of them is to write write with mei milin, which is this gall solution, onto the get. You write their names, and then you give them a pen with dio, and they write over it. Right? So they just have to trace over what you wrote. It's problematic because mei milin, based on what Rabbi Chanina says, is also itself kosher for writing, and then they'll just be writing on top of writing, and that's going to be not kosher for the get. So that's the context there. But what we see is that mei milin, again, it's not dio, because they asked the question, Rabbi Aval, from Rabbi Chanina, and the fact that he says you can't write, that you could write a get with aftsa, but they don't ask a question that, but mei milin itself is dio. So from here, it sounds like the proof is that just the gall solution itself is not dio. It wouldn't count as dio. Even if it was, it implies that when Rabbeinu Tam says that you can't write with afatsim, it sounds like he's now covering, as it were, two bases. He's saying that dio that's mixed with afatsim is not kosher, and dio and afatsim by itself would also not be considered dio. No matter how you slice it, it's not going to be considered dio. That's what it seems like from the proofs so far. Ba'od, the Sefer Torah by dio, and furthermore, Sefer Torah has to be written with dio. Kidamrin behabone, and now he quotes the Gemara that the Beit Yosef just quoted. Ktava shelo b'dio yiganeh. So if you wrote it not with dio, it has to be hidden away. But a Sefer Torah kai, and that's referring to a Sefer Torah, kidamashma b'hakometz rabba, as it's implied in the Gemara in Menachot and hakometz rabba. Now he calls the parak hakometz rabba. In other words, when we look at that, when we look at the Gemara there, 1 second, I wanted to have this up. This is a Gemara that you may already have learned, because it's one of the basic sources for Hilchot Stam. It's a Braita in Masechet Shabbat on Daf Kuf Gimel. Which I will share with you. The Braita here goes with Tav Tam, right? This is where we get the terminology of k'tivat tama. Uchtav you should write them. Shetehei k'tivat tama. It should be a whole script or a complete script. And then what does that mean? So the Braita defines it. Shelo yichtov alefin ayin. You shouldn't make your aleph like ayins. Ayin aleph. Don't make your ayin like aleph. Beitin kafin. Don't make your bets like kafs. Don't make your kafs like bets. Don't make your gimels like tzadis. Don't make your tzadis like gimels. Don't make your dalits like resh. Don't make your reshes like dalits. Don't make your hays like ches. Don't make your chesim like hays. Don't make your vavs like yud. Don't make your yuds like vavs. Don't make your zayins like nuns. Don't make your nun like zayin. Don't make your tets like pays, and don't make your pays like tets. Right. So this is basic Gemara where we start to understand that you have to be careful to make sure that letters that are similar don't look alike. Right. And that's part of how we get into the definitions of like what are the borders, what are the lines that you can't cross to that will ensure legibility. Then it goes on, Kfufim, Shutim, Kfufim, Memin, Samachin, Memin, Stumim, Tuchim, Stumim, Pashab Tucha lo Yasena Stuma, Stuma lo Yasena Tucha, right? You can't make letters that are supposed to be bent like a kaf, Pashut. You can't make a kaf kfufa where it should be a kaf pshuta, or vice versa. A kaf pshuta, a kaf sufi, you shouldn't make like a regular kaf. Memim samachim, right? This apparently is referring to a mem stuma, final mem, which is almost the same as the samach, except that the mem is at least partly squared off, and the samach is round. And samachim memim, stumim tuchim stumim. Letters that are open, you don't make closed, like a mem tucha. You don't make a mem stuma, you don't make open. You don't make a mem that's supposed to be open, make it closed. Then pashab tucha v'yasem stuma, right? The spaces between the parshiot, if it's supposed to be a tucha, don't make it stuma, and vice versa. Ktava k'shira, if you wrote it like a shira, if you wrote your text like a shira, like shirat hayam, or shekatavat shira kiyotzeba, if you wrote shirat hayam or shirat debora, right? A couple of other places in Tanakh, but if you wrote the tzura of the shira like regular text, finally, oshekatav shelo b'diya, or if you wrote it not with ink, right? Oshekatav et askarot b'zahav hare elu kanei. So if you wrote the Shemot Hashem with gold, these have to be hidden away. So Tosfos proves elsewhere, it's a different Tosfos, where they prove that the context for this Braita is specifically about Sefer Torah and not necessarily other parts of Tanakh. That gets into a different discussion. But we do see that it says Oshekatav Shelo B'Diya, that if you wrote it not with Diyo, and Tosfos knows that's talking about Sefer Torah in particular. So back to Tosfos. Okay, so this is back to the argument that Diyo Shalanu, right, that Rabbeinu Tam's claim is that our Diyo is the proper Diyo, and not Diyo that's made with Afatzim, or Afatzim by itself. Vehechi kadvinin b'Diyo shel Afatzim al klaf shel Sefer Torah, shehu me'ufatz. And how can you write with ink that has gall in it on parchment of a Sefer Torah that it itself was worked with gall? It was tanned with gall. Now, the strength of this question has to do with the part of the Gemara that I skipped over, but over there, the Gemara says explicitly, if you write with mei milin, which is, again, a gallnut solution, if you write with mei milin on parchment that was mubad, that was worked with gall, then that would not be considered to be writing because you wouldn't be able to see it, presumably. So, because back in the day, they used to work their parchment with gall. They used to tan it with gall. Right? They would tan, and that's how veal was made. And people who still make veal, that's how they make it. You can still buy veal today, and it's dark because it was tanned. So, according to the Gemara, if you write with mei milin, right, with this gall solution, you can't use that to write on something on parchment that's been worked with gall because it won't be able to see it. But Rabbeinu Tam understood it means that even if you wrote with dio that was mixed with gall, it would not be kosher for writing on parchment that was worked with gall. Right? This is actually taken from the Gemara itself, but again, about a slightly different matter. Rabbeinu Tam has another proof from the second chapter of Nida. Rabbi Ami pale kurta diuta ubadik. Rabbi Ami would break open a block of dio and check. The context for this is that in the Mishnah and Nida, it talks about different colors of blood that a woman may have, either as her menstrual flow or for some other reason. And there are various colors, and some of them are tahor, and some of them are tameh. So one of the colors that comes up is black. So it says that in order to check if something was black, if a blood stain was black, Rabbi Ami would break open some dio and check with that. So what does it mean that he broke open the dio? So Rabbeinu Tam explains it. Tosfos explains for Rabbeinu Tam, "V'hainu dio shelanu." That's our dio. That's our kind of ink. Shuhu yavesh, because it's dry. Our ink is dry. Shayach lomarbo pale kurza, and it would be pertinent. It would be in line with that to say that they broke open a piece. So what does he mean? That the dio that Rabbeinu Tam is talking about is a dio that they used to make by mixing together various ingredients, mostly pitch of some, or not pitch, but lamp black, right? Carbon that you would get from soot, that you would mix with other things, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you let it dry into a cake. And then when you want to write, you would scrape off some into water and mix it up. And that's what you would write with. That's dio. But dio that you make with afatzim, the gallnut ink, that's something you always keep in solution. It's a wet ink. So his proof is that when the Gemara here is just talking derech hagav, right, just by the way about dio, it's talking about that stam dio would be a dried block of ink. And that's another proof that the Gemara, when it talks about dio, was not talking about gallnut ink. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. V'hada amar b'perek b'mem adlikim, and that which it says in perek b'mem adlikim, right? This is in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. So you know that on Friday night in Musaf Ashkenaz, in between Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv, we recite perek b'mem adlikim. Talks about the different types of materials you can use for wicks or for fuel to light Shabbos candles. The Gemara there brings in some other related discussions. And one of the things that it talks about is this, Kol ha-srafim yafim midyo. All of the seraphim, all of the resins are good for making dio. The saraf kataf yafem mikulan. And the resin of balsam is the best of them. Yafem mikulan. Kol ha-srafim yafim midyo, saraf kataf yafem mikulan. I put the quote marks here in the wrong place. Should have been after the word kulan. Hahu saraf lav hainu gumi. That saraf that the Gemara is talking about, that's not gumi. It's not gum. Dein derech latet gumi ela b'dio shalafatzim, because we don't really need to, it's not normal to put gumi into dio unless dio is made from afatzim. In other words, when Tosfos saw this Gemara here that says Kol hasrafim yafim l'dio, it's a problem for him, because he says the way we make dio, we don't put in sraf, we don't put in gumi. We don't put in gumi. We do put in sraf, but we don't put in gumi, right? Because you only put gumi into dio of afatzim. So it can't be that saraf is gumi. Elo meru benatam desrafu lachluchit klipat ha'etz shosim mimenu dio shalanu. So maybe I said this wrong. So sraf, according to Tosfos, is the sap, and he's saying people do put sap into gallnut ink, but they don't put sraf. So what's sraf? Saraf. It's resin that you would get from tree bark. And that's what we do when we make our dio. Kamozu sirpa matsui, dipera kama denida. It's another, it's not actually not about dio, it's talking about emissions when a woman would bleed, menstrually or otherwise. It uses this term sirpa, which is the same root as saraf. And it means like something that would, it's using in this context, it's something that would, as it were, drip from a thing itself, as opposed to the sap, which is coming up through the tree. Right? This is the moisture of the blood of a woman. Yerek mar yeshlo saraf. A bitter vegetable has saraf. The yerek ein lo gumi ela lachluchit. And a yerek, vegetables don't have gumi, they don't have gum, but they do have a moisture, which might even be a sticky moisture. Mitoch kach. Okay, so all of these things are to prove that the srafim that were used for dio would be not sap, not gum Arabic, but there would be a resin that would come from trees. There could be a resin that comes from trees. Mitoch kach oser Rabbeinu Tam lichtov sefer Torah b'dio shel afatzim. Okay, so because of all of this, Rabbeinu Tam forbade the writing of a sefer Torah with ink that was made with gall. Mashma b'perek kol kitfei the kol svarim lo ba'u dio chutz mimigila herashti b'perek kol kitfei. And this is a completely side issue for us right now, and says that which is implied in the Gemara in Shabbat, b'perek kol kitfei, all svarim, meaning Sifrei Tanakh, don't need to be written with dio except for Megillah. He said, I explained that over there. That's a separate issue. Okay, so this is I did this Tosfos to try to make a little bit clearer about what the Beit Yosef is talking about in his discussion here, because he he takes a rather long discussion about Dio, and he just gives us a tiny bit. So just to read it again. Right. He said, Omer Rabbeinu Tam Diosh mitaknim b'afatzim lo mikre Dio. So he wants us to know that Rabbeinu Tam held that if you add afatzim to Dio, it's no longer called Dio. And then he brings from the Gemara in Gittin we saw the Tosfos there. The Ken Katsuv Bismag. Smag is the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, Siman Kaf Hey, and the Sefer Truma Siman Kuf Tzadi Hey. The Smag was written by Moshe of Kusi, who's a French rabbi, one of the Baalei Tosfot, and the Smag is it's rather an interesting work. It's the 613 mitzvot. Each mitzvah is discussed in some depth, bringing in halachic material. Of course, the structure is based on the Rambam's listing of the 613 mitzvot, but it brings in the learning from the line of Tosfot, right, from Rashi and the Tosfos, and the way they learned those sources, which is not always the same as the way the Rambam learned them. And so he has a discussion there on Dio, and he quotes the Rabbeinu Tam. Similarly, the Sefer Truma, which actually is slightly earlier than the Smag. The Sefer Truma was also written by one of the Baalei Tosfot, one of the people who was in the school of Tosfot. And again, he quotes Rabbeinu Tam. Both of these have slightly lengthier discussions about Dio, but enough for what we're interested in. The Harash Katav Hilchot Sefer Torah. So the Rosh, when he talks about this in Hilchot Sefer Torah, he says De'ena Raya. In other words, he pushes away Rabbeinu Tam's claim. This is Rabbeinu Tam's claim from the Gemara that you can't use Dio with afatzim, because I see from the Gemara that aftza is one of the things that you can write with, and it's not Dio, right? That was our first contention that we saw from Rabbi Chanina and the Gemara in Gittin. So he says, okay, but that's not a proof. Demei aftza l'chudei eino nikra Dio. He says, like, what are you talking about, Rabbeinu Tam? Over there in the Gemara, when it says that you could write a get with mei aftza, and that's not Dio, but that's the point. It's talking about only a galnat solution. It's not something that itself would ever be called Dio. It doesn't mean that if you mixed it in with Dio, that it would make the Dio pasul. Aval kishim arvim balkomus shikorim guma bila'az nikra Dio. Now he says something a little bit different than what I just said, that when you add in humus, which is the gum Arabic or the gum, that does, then it is called Dio, right? Which Tosos alluded to earlier, that gall ink that has humus, that they would put humus, they put gum into that ink. And you could write with it even on parchment that was tanned with afatzim. Because what he's saying is, once you add in the humus, it makes it dark enough that you would be able to distinguish it from a brownish background. In short, Rabbeinu Tam says, if you make Dio, you're not allowed to add afatzim. The Rosh says, no, it's okay to add afatzim, and you can make Dio with afatzim. Now, remember, we saw in the Gemara in Eruvin last week that Rabbi Meir used to have something he called Dio that he added kankantum to, right? So it implies that Dio is something that didn't necessarily have kankantum, didn't talk about afatzim. And here we have this discussion about afatzim. So the Rambam, the Perusha Mishnah, the Perek Sheni de Sota, the Rambam in his explanation of his commentary on the Mishnah in the second chapter of Sota, and we saw the Mishnah in Sota last week. You could look at the Rambam there. Katav Shemi Shomer Sefer Torah HaKatuv Ba'al Chibar Pasul Utoeh. He says that somebody who says that a Sefer Torah that's written with Al Chibar, that such a Sefer Torah would be pasul, he's making a mistake. Ve'arif b'tama davar b'yer shama ma'atik she'al chibar u'shal afatzim. So the ma'atik, the copyist, who was writing, who added a note into the Rambam's commentary, noted that al chibar is afatzim. It's the gall. And we see that the Rambam says specifically that anybody who says that if you add gall to the ink, that you write a Sefer Torah, that would be pasul. He says anybody who says that is making a mistake. You can put afatzim into the ink. And the tilim b'tocho kankantu. And you can put into it kankantu. Now, this is a little bit confusing, and actually I sent you a couple of weeks ago a tshuva of the Rambam where he talks about this in greater depth. It's, if you haven't read it, try to read through it. And next time, I don't think we'll go through the whole thing, but I'm going to go through a little bit of it. But for now, just in the last part of the shir, we'll look at what the Rambam says. Here he quotes what the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah. Okay, so the Rambam in the first chapter of Hilchot Tzvin, Hachadal and Hey, he says, Ketzad Maaseh HaDyo. The Rambam tells us how do you make Tyo? So you kabtzin ha'ashan shel shmanim or shel zefet or shel sha'abar yotzei b'hem. You gather up the smoke from oils or from pitch or from wax or things like that. In other words, and by the way, I did this way back when. I made ink using this basic method. You take a bunch of candles and you put like a piece of glass on top. And you know that the smoke is going to rise and then you'll be left with dirty glass, right? So what you do is you take the black off, that's mostly carbon. You take that off and then govlino to b'srafa ilan. Mix that with the sap from the tree, with a ma'at dvash and a little bit of honey. Ulototino to harbe, you mix it very hard with dakino to, and you crush it, or again, like push it together. Ad shiaseh rikikin, until you make it into cakes. Ubiabshino to, and you dry it. Matzniino to, and you put it away. Ubishat ktiva shorehu b'mei aftza uchuyotze bo. The kotev bo. Hang on. Oops. Yes, by smoke is meant soot. Yes, that's what it means. Soot. That's the word. Right? The soot rises and sticks to the glass. And again, it's mostly carbon. And then you take it and you mix it with these other things and you make it into a cake. You let them dry out. And then when you want to write, you soak the ink in water. Although davar. And then you have ink. Then and he says when you when you use it, you soak it. He says explicitly, you soak it in gall, right? So the Rambam held that chatchila, you make the dio. It's true. In other words, if you think about the sources that were brought, that Rabbeinu Tam brought to prove that dio doesn't have afatzim, so the Rambam would agree with all that, but he says that in practice, when you go to write, that's when you put it into a gall nut solution. The dio itself does not have gall. But then later on, you're going to add the gall by soaking the dried dio in a gall solution. Kotevbo she'im timchakenu yanimchak. And that's what you write with, that if you would erase it, it would, if you go to erase it, it will be erased. It will erase. This is the best kind of dio. This is mitzvah min ha'muchar. This is the choicest way to do the mitzvah of writing Sfarim, Tefillin, and Mezuzot. And he says, "V'im katav shoshtan b'mei aftza v'kankantum shehu omeid ve'eno nimchak ksherim." He says, but if you wrote all three of them, Sfarim, Tefillin, and Mezuzot, with mei aftza v'kankantum, if you wrote them with the gall solution that you mixed with kankantum, which was the vitriol, that's permanent and it's not erasable, it's also kosher, right? So the ideal dio is something that is erasable. We talked about it last time. It means that if you rub it with water, it will erase. If you have this mixture of afatzim and kankantum, it doesn't erase like that with water. It won't go away with water. Im kain, if this is true, if what the Rambam goes on, if what I'm saying is true, Mami ata hahalacha she'emra Moshe misinai shiu kotvim b'tio. So then there's we saw earlier, the Gemara says it's halacha Moshe misinai. The Rishonim said it's halacha Moshe misinai that you have to write with dio. So if you can write both with the first kind of dio that I mentioned, where you make dried dio and then soak it in gall solution, or if you make this other kind of dio, which is gall solution that you mix with vitriol, so then what's excluded in the halacha Moshe Sinai? Like, why do I need the halacha Moshe Sinai to tell me something? I'll just say, a lot of things I can write with. The ma'ed sha'ar minei tzivonin. So the halacha Moshe Sinai is coming to exclude other pigments, kigon ha'adom, like red, ha'yarok, or green, or yotzei bahem, those, and other pigments like that. Shin katav b'sfarim, or b'tfilin, or b'mesuzot, or filo ot achat, yish'ar minei tzivonin. If you wrote even one letter in stam, in any of these other colors, b'zahav, or if you wrote with gold, now, right, he's bringing in the other thing that was mentioned, that if you write the askarot in gold, he says if you write any letter with gold, hare elu psulim, they would be pasul. So we see the Rambam does not, the Rosh and the Rambam do not agree with Rabbeinu Tam. The Rosh holds that you can add afatzim to dio, and the Rambam holds you can also write with lechatchila, you write dio that's mixed with afatzim. So, yes. Katvu shama hagaot b'shem atosot Rabbeinu Simcha shikar nireh שבכל דבר שיעשה אדם דיו בדבר שיתקיים ויהיה ניכר על כף דיו הוא. The Haggaot Sham, that's on the Rambam there, if you look at the Rambam. So we mentioned one of the commentaries on the Rambam is the Hagot Maimoniot, which is written also by one of the students of the Maram Rutenberg, and he writes there in the name of the Tosfot and Rabbeinu Simcha that it seems that the Ikar, right, the main halacha seems to be that anything that a person, kol davar she'aseh adam dio, davar she'itkayem, if he makes something that's dio, something that is permanent, and it's recognizable on the klaf, it will be considered as dio. In other words, this going in the line of what the Rambam seems to be saying, yes, it could be that there was something very specific that the Gemara meant by dio, and that's what the Rambam holds as mitzvah min hamubchar, to write with. It's this very specific kind of method of making a black ink for writing. But Hagot Maimonides concludes, and it seems that the Rambam also thinks that if you can make, he doesn't say here explicitly black, but the Rambam says it has to be black. If you can make a black pigment that will make a mark on parchment that will stand and not just rub off, easily, that's kosher. All of those things are kosher. That would be kosher for writing stuff. Right? Because we see that the Rambam and the Rosh held that you can add afatzim to the dio, you can make dio from afatzim and kankantum, and this is the practice of the world, right? This is a common practice. Most of the Beit Yosef says, already in his time, he says, this is the dio that most people use, is to take the gallnut and mix it with the vitriol. And that's the dio that we use. We learn from the Rambam's formulation that when the Gemara said earlier that if you wrote the Shemot Hashem in gold, that you have to hide them away, that's lav dafka askarot. The Gemara didn't mean only if you wrote the Shem Hashem in gold. Dafil ba'otachat mishar tevot nami nifsal. Even if you wrote one letter from any letter of the Torah, or tefillin or mezuzot or anything with gold, it's also pasul. V'chein katav Rabbeinu Yerucham be'tiv bet chelek bet. We'll stop here. I'll just point out, if you've ever tried to make your dio, you do have to boil the solution. The Rambam's basic recipe doesn't need boiling, but if you want to take, like, scrape from one of the cakes that you made with the Rambam's basic recipe and put it into a gall solution, what you really need to do is boil up the. You would take the gall and pulverize it. Or now you can actually buy this. You can just buy pulverized gall, and you boil it up. It doesn't dissolve in just cold water. The thing with the vitriol, if you try that, there also you can take copper sulfate. You have to boil that together with the gallnuts, with the gallnut solution. It doesn't just dissolve in cold water. And when you boil the vitriol, the kankantum with the afatzim, it turns black. It becomes black because those items by themselves are not black, but together they form a black ink. Okay, that's it for now. Are there any questions before we stop? Okay, so that's it. Thank you for joining me. And there won't be shiur now. Next week, I'm traveling, God willing, back to the States. And I'll be in touch with everybody. I think the next time we meet actually is not going to be till after Sukkot. but feel free to be in touch and ask me any questions, and God willing, we'll continue after the Chagim. Thank you very much for joining me, and take care.